In any case, I want to divide my remarks into the public Murray Rothbard and the personal reminiscences that I have of him. Murray was, I would say, the best economist who ever lived, bar none. His books, Man, Economy and State, Depression, Logic of Action, are just the tip of the iceberg for him. He, in an era of specialization where economists nowadays don't just specialize in, micro or macro or money or labor or methodology or history or trade or public choice or law and economics or environmentalism or taxation or anything like that, but they specialize in a very narrow area, say of international trade. You only do tariffs, or you only do tariffs between this country and that country. Well, in such an era of specialization, Murray was really an expert in all of them, and it was just the most amazing thing. His article on air pollution, I think, was the best thing that was ever written in environmental economics, and so on down the line. It's not just that he knew little bits of economics in the various parts of economics, but he was an expert and a guiding light in pretty much all of them. There is one thing that I disagree with him on. Well, there are several things I disagree with Murray on. One of them came up on the film where he said that the Renaissance of Austrianism came about in 1974, where the South Royalton Conference started, and there were about 30 of us kids. I was a kid then. It's hard for you to realize, but I was young once, and I was a kid, and we had this Royalton Conference, and there must have been 30 or 40 of us kids, and then there was Murray and Israel Kirzner and Ludwig Lachmann, who were the professors. That's one thing that happened in 74, and the other thing was that Hayek won his Nobel Prize. And you heard Murray say that this sort of is part of the Renaissance. I think Murray was wrong on this, and I think Joe Salerno was much more correct in his recent article. I don't know if it's published or not, but he gave a speech on it, and he might give that again, where he said that the real Renaissance of Austrian economics didn't come in 74, it came in 62. 62 was the publication of Man, Economy and State. And he asked the question, well, how came it to be that there were 35 young professors, such as myself and graduate students, that came to Royalton? Where did they come at? Had they come? Because at one time, Mises and Hayek thought that Austrianism would end with them. So, in my view, Murray really is the one-man band responsible for the Renaissance of Austrian economics. The article by Joe Salerno is absolutely magnificent. Murray was wrong on this one. But he wasn't just an Austrian economist, a great Austrian economist. I would go so far as to say he was not only a libertarian, but the greatest libertarian that ever libertarianized, I guess. His book, The Ethics of Liberty, For a New Liberty, Power and Market, are just magnificent monuments to the libertarian edifice. He was also a historian, the Inflation or the Depression of 1819, his history series on the U.S., his history of thought, his revisionism, his conspiracy theory. He's just a historian par excellence. If he were only a historian or only a libertarian or only an Austrian, he would have made a magnificent contribution. But he was all these three, plus he was the leading anarchist theoretician. He was also a bon vivant. Even Buckley, who was no fan of Murray's, used to talk about Murray and his merry band. And you could see from his talk that we just heard that, he's just a giggly, kind of happy guy. Before I met him, when I read the stuff, I sort of pictured him as about 6'5", and had a machine gun here and maybe a spear there, sort of like a black power guy. And then you meet this little fat, giggly guy. It's the most amazing thing. He was also a joiner, an activist. He was in the Peace and Freedom Party, the Libertarian Party, a strategist, a movement builder par excellence, as you can see from his contributions to the Mises Institute. He is also a very, 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 very prolific author. If you stack all of his publications side by side, they stretch for, yards or meters or whatever. I remember once when I was a young lad, and I used to keep track of how many pages I could write a day. And if I wrote 5 pages a day, I would sort of say, okay, you did pretty well. This would be, a page would be 300 words, so that would be 1,500 words. And I said, okay, pretty good. Every once in a while, I do 10 or maybe 15 pages. One day, I got up early in the morning, and I worked from maybe 8 in the morning until 2 the next morning. And I did 23 pages. And this was amazing, almost 50% more than my previous record. Now that I'm an old duffer, I don't keep track, and I can't remember all that. But I kept track of of how many pages, and I was feeling pretty snarky, so I called up the man, Murray, and I said, well, how many pages can you do in a day? Now, I wasn't comparing quality, just quantity. And Murray gives me, who counts? And and then I persist. I was very persistent, and I still am pretty persistent. And I insisted, no, you got to tell me. And you know what he said? He said 8 pages an hour. So in my best day, again, forget about quality. We're just talking quantity. In my best day, by far, and it took me from 8 in the morning till 2 the next morning, I did almost 3 of his hours. And he does first draft stuff. I mean, you know, once he's finished with it, he's finished with it. There are X's, but that's him thinking along. And then he just sends it out to be published. No wonder. I mean, a good typist can probably beat him. I mean, a good typist, 100 words a minute, you can probably do way more than 8. But he's creating stuff, just, I don't know where. He's channeled to someone upstairs, I guess. Okay, some experiences. I first met Murray in 1966. I went to his apartment, and his apartment was just an experience of its own. There were books everywhere. I mean, most people have bookcases all over the place. He had them, I think, on the ceiling. No, he didn't have them on the ceilings, but he had, right up and down every wall. You sort of walk like this because, there were bookcases coming after you, and just piles of books all over the place. It was the most amazing thing. He converted me to anarchism in about 10 minutes. I was sort of a limited government pinko type, but what he mainly did was sort of use my own arguments against me. Like I would say, well, the reason we should privatize the post office is because, if you do a good job, you make money and you expand your base of operations, and if you do a bad job, you lose and you go bankrupt, and this weeds out inefficiency. And Murray said, yeah, but why can't you apply it to police and courts and armies and whatever, and all of a sudden the light bulb went on over my head. It was just the most magical conversion. No snakes, no nothing like that. It was just a quick conversion. Revisionist history took a few months. I had to read a lot of books. It just seemed weird to me. Anarchism seemed weird to me too before I met him, but the revisionist history, I had to read a few books about the H-bomb and, why we dropped it. The idea was to send notice to the Russians. It didn't have that much to do with the Japanese. I'm not a historian. I'm no professional historian. I'm having enough trouble with economics, but that was one of my interests. It took years for me to get out of neoclassical economics. I'd just gotten my PhD, and I had a vested interest in indifference curves and in matrices and in regressions and all sorts of stuff, and I wasn't very open to that. But I just saw Murray as some sort of Mozart in terms of all this libertarian and anarchist stuff. But the Austrianism took me a long, long time to get. I wanted to mention other people in the living room crowd because the living room was part of the Murray history. The people I got, apart from his wife Joey, Leonard Liggio, Joe Peden. Now, some of you might know some of these people. Some of them are with us. Some of them have passed away. Some of them are not with the Mises Institute. Some of them are. Leonard Liggio, Joe Peden, Ron Hamaway, Ralph Rako, Bob Smith, Walter Grinder, who is my own personal guru, sort of second to Murray, Larry Moss, Jerry Wallows, Jerry O'Driscoll, Mario Rizzo, Joe Salerno, Roy Childs, Father James Sadowski, S.J., Jerry Tuccilli. In those days, if I or Murray didn't know you, you weren't a libertarian. Because we knew all the libertarians, and there weren't that many. And if we didn't know you, you weren't an Austrian. Now there are entire groups that I've never even heard of. It's the most amazing thing to see the burgeoning of it since 1966 when I really got started in this. Let me relate a few episodes from my own personal history. One is this trip that I took with my first wife, from whom I've been divorced many years, and my friend Jerry Wallows. And what Murray did is he gave us lists of people who were libertarians or Austrians in various cities, like Chicago, St. Louis, Denver, L.A., San Francisco. I only remember 2 of the people that I met then. One was Dick Riemann of Top Dog in San Francisco, and the other was Wilson Clark, who died much too young. But what happened, what I remember very much is Murray would give us 4 or 5 names of people in Chicago who were all libertarians, and never did they hear of each other. And we were sort of like the Johnny Appleseeds, you know, inviting them all to dinner, and then they would meet each other and say, "What? You're a libertarian? You're from Chicago? Wow." And I'm sort of a bit of a yenta that's, you know, I don't know, the Yiddish here is a little weak, but introducing people and gossiping and stuff. And like last time I was here, there were 2 guys from Phoenix who had never heard of Mark Victor, who is a libertarian who puts on conferences there. So I sort of emailed them each, and in true libertarian style, I ordered them to interact with each other. I mean, this libertarian is okay in theory, but, you know, but, you know, naked aggression is is where it's at. Another was the Murray Bookchin case. Murray Bookchin was some sort of Marxist, enviro, pinko, watermelon, you know, green on the outside, red on the inside, and somehow Murray Bookchin and Murray Rothbard were introduced to each other, and they shared a lot of things, but, you know, he was a goddamn commie, for God's sakes. and that didn't do too well. There were a few meetings, and then they parted. The next one that I wanted to mention is Carl Hess. Now, when we first met Carl Hess, he was a Goldwater speechwriter. I think he was partially responsible for the magnificent Goldwater what is it? Defense of liberty. Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in pursuit of justice is, you know, no virtue. So when we first met him, you know, it's sort of like, you know, the elephant and the mouse is sitting on the elephant's back, and they go over this bridge, and the bridge starts swaying, and then the mouse says, "Boy, we made that bridge sway." Well, me and Murray, you'll never guess which animal I was. We met Carl Hess, and when we met Carl Hess, he was, you know, some sort of right-winger. And under Murray's magic, you know, you talk about the magic of the marketplace, but there's the magic of Murray. He pretty much converted Carl Hess into a libertarian, pure libertarian. This was during his, what was that, the Penthouse, I think it was a Playboy, a Penthouse, Playboy interview, which was very, very libertarian. And then Carl started, he came from right, I guess this is your right, and he came to the center, moderate libertarian anarchism, you know, nothing extreme here. And then he sort of hived off into the left. And I remember his first move to the left was, we were having this Libertarian Scholars Conference, and there was also a protest at Fort Dix, which was across the Hudson River in New Jersey. And what Carl did is he led about half of the people out to Fort Dix to protest whatever. And the implication was, I mean, this wasn't all bad. I mean, you know, war is, you know, was the Vietnam War. But Murray's point was, look, what we're doing here, the Libertarian Scholars Conference, that's important too. And if you want to go march on Fort Dix, march on it on your own time. Don't be ruining our conference, which we can only have once a year because we have very little funds. And appreciate that this too is important, that the intellectual contribution to the fight is crucial. And, you know, just being one more body along with a bunch of hippy-dippies isn't going to really do much. I remember they had these anti-war protests and, you know, the lefties, U.S. out of Vietnam. And I remember there was this group at Fordham University, and they had this sign, U.S. out of the Bronx. This made Murray smile. These were the people that he was influencing, you know, a little bit more radical than out of Vietnam. Another person that I met in the early days is Roger Garrison. Is he here now? Oh, well, I can say anything I want since he's not here. Murray was the sort of person who would get up at 3 in the afternoon and go to sleep at around 6 in the morning. So Roger Garrison came over, and, you know, he came at 9 o'clock or so, and he wanted to show us his stuff, which then became his book on the triangle, and, you know, showing the mainstream how you can put Austrian business cycle in geometrical form. And it must have been, 11:30, and Roger starts making movements like he's ready to leave, because, you know, it's 11:30, and most times you have a dinner party or something, 11:30, the host wants to get rid of you. And, Murray was appalled. Why are you leaving? Well, poor Roger was sort of half falling asleep. No, tell us your stuff. So at around midnight or 1 in the morning, Roger's giving us his stuff with the triangles and that stuff. So just one more interesting experience that I had with Murray. Another was the, I don't know, Louis, you allowed to mention the name of the billionaire nowadays? Or is this still, sorry? Oh, okay. Well, the Coctopus. Guy's name was Charles Koch, and who was it that came up with the Coctopus name? Sam Conkin, I think it was. And our experience, Murray mentioned the billionaire. He didn't mention his name. A lot of the times what Murray said about Mises is true of Murray. What Koch was really trying to do in those days was have Austrian economics without you-know-who. And you-know-who was Mises, because Milton Friedman didn't like Mises, because Mises once called him a socialist, and Milton doesn't take kindly to be called a socialist. He thinks that's too extreme. Well, the latest effort on the part of these people is to have Austrian economics without you-know-who, but now you-know-who is not Mises, but Murray. So this is just another indication of, the certain people that are in the influence or under the influence of the Coctopus. Another interesting episode came up with Murray's joining these various groups. We once joined this group called the Peace and Freedom Party. Peace and Freedom Party. I was young and innocent. Believe me, I'm it's all Murray's fault. What happened, there were 3 groups. There was a gigantic democratic socialist, the Mensheviks, and then there was the progressive labor. These were the Maoists. And then there were about 10 of us libertarians. And there were hundreds and hundreds of the Democrat socialists and maybe 100 progressive labor and about 8 or 10 of us. So naturally, we allied ourselves with the progressive labor, and we had a united caucus. Now, by the way, I'm doing my PhD dissertation on rent control. It's just a sidelight. So we had this caucus, and if you're part of a caucus, you have to compromise. So we came in, somehow Murray concocted this thing that we had to come out, what was it, in favor of rent control, but also in favor of the gold standard. You get that? So we're now having the vote, should we have rent control? And Murray's, trying to, you know what I'm saying? So, I'm ordered to say yes, and now the progressive labor people have to favor the gold standard. And Murray's explaining to them, this is against international capitalists or something like that. and they fell for it. You really had to be there to appreciate the absolute lunacy of us allying with the Maoists. It was just, it was silly, but, I was young and in love in some sense. I mean, we were just good friends, but, I revered Murray. I'm not ashamed of it. I still do in some sense, but Murray was the sort of a person that you could disagree with him. And I'll talk about some of my disagreements with him later. Another was the start of the not the Journal of Libertarian Studies, the Center for Libertarian Studies. We started that with a bunch of people, and I was on the board of it, and Murray was on the board of it, and we'd sit around this long table in Manhattan, and we'd come out with CLS brochures. It was just interesting seeing Murray as board member. It wasn't as funny, but I have to mention that's part of my experience with Murray. Okay, some more personal things. I have the privilege of attending the last session of Mises at NYU. Murray took a bunch of us down there, and at that time Mises was this small, little, wizened man. You could hardly hear him. He could not speak too loudly. He couldn't hear. Percy Graves with big, booming voice yell in Mises' ear what the questions were, and then Mises would sort of talk back. It didn't really mean much to me. I could hardly hear him, but I felt that I was in the presence of greatness, and I could tell my grandchildren and you people that I was at the last session of the Mises seminar at NYU. So it's a way of connecting you through me back to Vienna, which is, I guess, if you're of a certain mindset, you can appreciate the connection between various time epochs in our movement. Murray was an inveterate risk player. You know what risk is? You know, the taking over the world. And Murray used to say, well, ordinary people who play it, you know, they're a little sort of ashamed or apologetic, but we anarchists, you know, we can take over the world with great enthusiasm. And Murray always had the view that the defense was always favored because they would fight harder for their territory. I mean, here we have a risk analysis of what's happening in Iraq. You know, when one country attacks the other, Murray would root for the defense because, you know, that's the way he was. I swear I used to get stomach cramps, and it wasn't from the food. Jerry was a magnificent cook. I got stomach cramps from laughing. Murray just had us in stitches, on and on. You could see a little bit of it in that tape that you just saw. But in his living room, you really were in risk of life and limb, or at least stomach, if you get stomach cramps from laughing. These were sort of people that my mother warned me against. They stayed up late. Ma B didn't like that. They drank alcohol. Alcohol, they drank. I mean, they were fat. I must have gained 40 pounds. And when I complained, Murray would say, every calorie says yay to life. Ma Block said, foolosophy. That was her view of this whole thing. Foolosophy. That was the way she saw it. By the way, Murray is a compromiser. You know, he talks a big deal about no compromiser, but Murray is a compromiser, and I once caught him compromising. He once said that he would accept as an interim program the budget of George Washington. See, I got him there. He can't claim that, you know, like when Murray was explaining why Mises was rejected and he said he was non-compromising, it's almost as if he was speaking about himself. With this possible exception of the George Washington budget, was only an interim, thing to show his moderation. He really was uncompromising. He was never bitter. Just what he said about Mises. He was always cheerful. He never had a prestigious university post. With apologies to UNLV, it's not Harvard, where he really belonged. He was just like Mises. The parallels are strong. They neither had much of a welcome from the mainstream. He was enormously patient with me. Everyone says that he was vicious and nasty and intolerant. He was very patient with me. What happened on a typical day, I'd read Man, Economy, and State. Remember, I was a kid. I was 25, 26. I'd read Man, Economy, and State, and it was sort of blowing me away. This was really magnificent stuff. It was sort of like Mozart. And then I knew I'd see Murray at night for one of his soirees. And I realized that he would actually speak to me. It was just crazy. I'd never done anything. I was just this young, dumb kid. I had a PhD, big deal. I did nothing. The great man would actually speak to me. I was just a young pup. Later I realized he just wanted to be friends. But I couldn't. Him be friends with me? Come on, get real. That's crazy. It's sort of like, you know, being friends with Bach or Vivaldi or Handel or other of my favorite music people. So I decided I had to be worthy. How could I be worthy of the great man's attention? Well, bug the hell out of him. Don't ask. That's my own personality. To be worthy, I had to show that I was, reading the stuff seriously, and I would criticize him. One time he had Mises' picture on the wall, so I criticized him for that. Because Mises was, not an anarchist. He was weak on this or that. And Murray just smiled. He was very tolerant of me. Another thing that we disagreed with for a long, long time when I first met him was this issue of voluntary slavery and inalienability. I have an article, I think it's out now in the latest Journal of Libertarian Studies, where I attack a whole bunch of people, and I'm sure they'll get back at me, which indicates that it's not a cult. We just have at it. We're good friends. And I used to bug him about that.
Is there a question? How do you get voluntary slavery?
Sorry?
How do you get voluntary slavery?
How do you get it?
It seems like an oxymoron. I mean, isn't it?
Get out. I'm kidding. I didn't intend to go into this. This was not supposed to be substantive, but since you ask, I suppose I can answer. And again, this is an unpopular view in our circles. The only other person of any libertarian credentials I've ever found who agrees with me on this is Robert Nozick. And I've got a lot of criticism for him, so I'm not using this as an argument from authority. I think he was wrong on a lot of things, but he was a bright guy. The argument is as follows. Don here is a very rich guy, and he's long wanted me to be his slave. He's into that. He likes whips and stuff. and my son has this dread disease. And fortunately, there's a cure for it, but it costs $5 million, and I'm poor, and I don't have the money. So I go to Don, I say, look, Don, give me $5 million, and I'll take the $5 million, and I'll give it to my son's doctors, because I value his life more than my freedom. And then I become Don's slave, and then every time I get snippety, Don whips me. Now, ordinary people might call that assault and battery, but I would call it voluntary slavery. Namely, it's contractual slave agreement. So this is the sort of the explanation. I don't really want to go into defending this and attacking it. That's a long, substantive subject, and we're supposed to be light here and just giving reminiscences. But what I would do is I'd bug the hell out of him on this. It was just insufferable. I had no, sense. Some people would say I haven't got any sense, but that's a whole other issue. But the point is that he was just sweet with me. He would disagree and, sometimes try to change the subject. I was like a bulldog. I wouldn't let go. But, we were friends for many years. So when people say that, he's nasty, it's just sort of like what he said about Mises. People say that Mises was nasty and snarky, and Murray never met that kind of Mises. Well, I never met that kind of Murray. Murray was like a kid. He was like a kid at Christmas. I was not picked as, by the way, not only am I the only co-author, but I'm one of 4 co-editors with Murray. The other 3 are Leonard Liggio and George Resch in Left and Right, and Ronald Radosh on a book. I was also co-editor with him on the Review of Austrian Economics. I was not the first choice. What happened was somebody else was chosen to be the associate or the assistant editor or the co-editor or whatever. And you have to remember that this was the years when the Coctopus had refused, had told Lou, you can't do this, and this is evil, and there was this boycott on us. So not only did the emperor's wife have to be pure, but she or he had to be seen to be pure. Pure in this case meant a refereed journal. Refereed means you send it out to referees and you're bound or heavily guided by what they say. So Murray would get a transcript and he'd start scribbling on it. Because he was like a kid. He'd say, whoop-de-doo, woo-wee, we got an article for our journal. And he'd start scribbling on it. And I'd tell him to hold out his hand and I'd go like that. And I say, Murray, you can't do that. Let me make some copies, then you can scribble all you want. But it was sort of like, it wasn't that he didn't want to have a refereed journal, it's just that he couldn't resist getting his hand on papers. So I had, great respect for him, his integrity, but I knew in some ways he was like a kid. You just couldn't stop him. So, we told the secretary, don't give him any originals, make sure you give him copies. And then the Review of Austrian Economics was born. The situation with the Review of Austrian Economics is that now it's under the editorship of Pete Betke, but the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics sort of took over where the Review of Austrian Economics left off. So the way I like to think of it is that our Austrian journal is the Review of Austrian Economics for the first 8 or 10 years, and then the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, which was its successor journal. What else do I have here? The only other thing I have, and then if people have questions, I'd be glad to respond, was I once went to this meeting of the annual meeting of the New York State Economics Association in Geneseo, New York, and I was Murray's discussant. And his paper was on, what was it on? Value, freedom, and economics. We each had an article, and I was his discussant, and he was my discussant. And I criticized him on something in public in front of this conference. I forget what it was, something like he said that regulation was only this wide, and I said it was wider, and he just sort of said, well, I accept that criticism. And this was done in front of other professors at an academic conference. Just one more indication of what kind of person he was. And, there was never any resentment or anything like that. He was sort of proud of me, which is roughly the attitude that Murray had with Hans Hoppe's Argument from Argument, which, in my view, transcended what Murray did. And instead of Murray saying to Hans, well, you're evil because you're transcending me, Murray was Hans's warmest supporter on this Argument from Argument business. I think that Stefan Kinsella's article on intellectual property came out after Murray died, but I know, and this is a magnificent article. It won the award for the best journal article in the Journal of Libertarian Studies for the last 2 or 3 years or something like that. It was just a ripping in of what Murray had to say on intellectual property, and I know that had Murray been here, he would have just giggled or, wrecked about his wrongness and would have welcomed this kind of an idea. So that's the kind of person that Murray was, and that's my view of me and Murray. Well, the movie starts at 8, and I think we should leave in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, so leave a 15-minute break. But if there are any questions, I'd be glad to elaborate. Yes?
I was just wondering if you could ask Jeff Tucker to tell me the mystery speaker. I'm really curious.
Yes?
All right. I should preface this by saying I really wish you'd provided scotch instead of beer because it's going to make the stones hurt. It would have made the stones hurt a whole lot less after I asked this. Okay. I was talking to one of the professors earlier about this, but Austrians seem to they completely bash neoclassical economists because they heavily use mathematics. But it seems like their biggest problem with the use of mathematics that they do use is that it's the same as that with the problem with chaos theory. You can't have infinite resolution. In other words, you can't actually predict the future. And so most Austrian economists seem to have a very heavy mathematic background. And so and using their logical a priorism, I think that they would be at the forefront with using mathematics to prove both new theories and also better understand previous historical events.
Well, let me say the following about that. First of all, I don't think that we, speaking for my fellow colleagues, or me, speaking just for myself, bash neoclassicists in everything. The way I see it, here is Austrianism and here is neoclassicism, and there is an overlap. And we agree with them on these things. Murray used to say Milton Friedman is sound as a bell on rent control. He's magnificent on the minimum wage. He's great on unions. He's wonderful on tariffs. But instead of talking about those things, he talks about things over here where we don't agree with him on, like money and education and things like that. But there are vast areas, and I don't mean that anything to do with the size of things. It's hard to quantify this, but there are vast areas where we agree, at least with the public policy implications, and even with the economic analysis of rent control or minimum wage with supply and demand. The second thing I get out of your question, this is a little off the topic, but what the heck, we're having fun, is the Austrian relationship with mathematics and econometrics. Now, there are two schools of thought on this. Jeff Herbener is on the other side of this from me, and I don't know how the other people stand, but my view is that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with econometrics or mathematical economics. Let's just take econometric regressions. It's rather the interpretation that you place on these things. The way they see it is that econometrics is going to test apodictic theory. For example, if I trade you this pen for your beer, I say this means we evaluate these things in opposite directions, and I like what you got more than I've got, and you like what I've got more than you got. That's the axiomatic apodictic theory, and these people want to go test it. Well, come on, give me a break. There's no way to test that. If you really understand what's going on, no, test. But you could illustrate this in various ways. And in my own work on rent control, I did econometric regressions. Now, when I did it, I thought I was really testing the theory, which is silly. Because every time I got it wrong, when the sign came out wrong,
Okay, we got to massage that data.
No. Oh, you cynic. No. Gary Becker was my dissertation advisor, and every time the sign came out wrong, Gary Becker said, "Oh, Block, my young genius, he's overturning." No. Every time the sign came out wrong, he said, "Block, you moron, go out and do it again until you get it right." Well, what kind of a test is that? I mean, we know the way the sign should be. The more rent control, the lousier the housing, right? So this is an illustration, and I'm maybe not as an extremist as I should be, but I don't see anything wrong with illustrating this. There are certain people, with my book, Defending the Undefendable, a lot of the criticism was, well, this is too radical. You need a cast iron stomach, and you'll turn off more people than you convert. And my view is I'm a methodological individualist on everything, including converting people. And yes, for most people, they need this slow, gradual process, sort of wean them into freedom. Whereas that book is sort of like a smack in the face with a wet fish or something. But my view is, well, it works with some people. And I've had success with that. Sometimes I use it in my classes, sometimes I don't. So different strokes for different folks. And I've also done econometric stuff recently on comparing the economic freedom in various countries with Gwartney and Lawson. And we found that, amazingly, we got the right signs, that the more economic freedom you have, the more wealth you have. But some people are convinced by that and can be convinced by nothing else. All this airy theoretical crap about freedom being beneficial goes right by them. So for those people, what's wrong with that? Now, there are certain purists that say you shouldn't do it. I think they're wrong. Maybe other faculty members will talk about that. But in my humble opinion, the Austrian criticism of statistics and economics is not a intrinsic one. It's rather one of interpretation and use. We don't think it can test theories, but it can certainly illustrate them, at least in my view. Yellow shirt?
Yeah, speaking of defending the indefensible, what inspired you to write that book? I mean, I was just reading some of it. It is, as you describe, a slap in the face with a cold pig. I couldn't be much better.
Well, what happened was I was writing my dissertation and I hated it. It was boring. Oh, it was horrible. It was just like pulling teeth. But there was the war in Vietnam, and I didn't want to go get my rear end shot off, so I stuck with it. And in order to motivate myself, I said, look, if you just do this one regression, I promise you, I have these internal, I'm not really psychotic, but, I have these internal discussions with myself, and I promised myself if I did this much on the dissertation, I could have a whole day to do whatever I wanted. And pervert that I am, what I wanted was to write about what a great guy the pimp was, or something like that. So at the end of the dissertation, I had about 30 articles, or 40 articles, I forget how many, of, what a great guy the blackmailer is, and the slander, and the libeler, and the pimp, and the prostitute, and this one and that one. And I had a book, so I got it published. But the motivation was to just rev myself up. So, by the way, I'm not in favor of pimps or anything like that. I'm not in favor of drug dealing. I'm just against putting them in jail because they are victimless criminals between consenting adults. So, clarify that. Dan?
When's volume 2 coming out?
I'm just so lazy. I've been so busy writing, I haven't had a chance. I've got enough for volume 2 and 3, but one of these days, as soon as I get a good research assistant, Dan. Yes?
You said that Murray Rothbard had called Milton Friedman a socialist, and libertarians tend to call everybody a socialist. So I know I do, but what was the actual situation in which that occurred, and for what?
Does anyone know why he called it?
It was Ludwig von Mises called
at the Mont Pelerin.
Yeah, I think if maybe you've been on the ship over there. They were all sitting around talking about the implementation of the withholding tax as an efficient way of fighting World War II. And Mises, was against it. And I guess he got up and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists." And then he stomped off the deck. Supposedly, though, when Friedman told the story at South Royalton, he said that Mises said, "You're all a bunch of goddamn socialists." And Murray leaned up to me and said, "Mises would have never used that term." So basically said they're all a bunch of socialists.
Yeah.
They weren't talking about getting rid of the, now the war was on getting rid of the income tax, but make it more efficient, basically.
Yeah. Well, I was once in a sort of a debate with Milton Friedman, and I was favoring privatization of roads. And he was bitterly opposed, and I said, "You're a road socialist." He didn't much like that. I can't understand why. But by the way, Joe, you weren't here. You came in right after I said this, but I took your side against Murray regarding Murray's view that the Renaissance of Austrian economics came out in 1974. I took the 1962 view. Is there a question? Yes, sir.
Well, building on this whole neoclassical Milton Friedman line of questioning, did Murray ever have any contact with Milton's son David or Brian Kaplan, the neoclassical anarchist contingent?
Well, Brian Kaplan came to the Mises University 2, 3, 4 years. I forget how many, Lou. There's more than one.
Yeah, two.
2 years. He was a young kid, maybe late high school, early college.
Very few high school students.
Right, very bright guy. And I've been involved in a long-standing debate with him on methodology, and I have to say that he is among the best of the Austrian critics, because he knows the stuff much better than Tullock or Friedman or any of these other guys. You know, Milton Friedman with this stuff that if two Austrians disagree, they'll have to shoot each other or something. I mean, that's just silly. I mean, you might as well say if two logicians disagree or two mathematicians or two geometricians disagree, they have to whip out the pistols or something. It's just silly. Whereas Brian Kaplan, I think, and in my article I say that he's one of the best critics, and I compare him to Nozick, another critic of Austrian economics. Joe?
Regarding, I think, David Friedman, we asked about David Friedman. At one point, David Friedman was going for his PhD in physics, and he was telling Murray that he was going to, thinking about moving into economics. Murray said, "Don't do that, David. We need good people in physics."
By the way, you noticed that Joe's impersonation of Murray was much inferior to mine. I don't know. Someone once said 2 generations of Friedman in economics is, too many. Or something. I don't know if Murray said that, but some people said that. David Friedman is an anarchist, but he's not an Austrian economist, and there are differences, but that's what makes the world go round. Differences. I've got time for one last question. Yes, in the back.
Yeah. You think the Austrian economics is the best theory, right?
Louder. I can't hear you.
Do you think the Austrian economics is the best theory, right, in the economic field? How
Yeah.
come the other side, people like yourself, right side, and others have more public support and public trust than you guys?
That's an interesting argument. If we're so good, why aren't we rich? Or why? Or
you think you're so good at it, why aren't you rich yet?
there's this guy Sherwin Rosen who wrote an article on making just that point, saying if Austrian is so good, why aren't you more popular? Or, in addition, saying since you're not popular, you're wrong. And Leland Yeager wrote a very good response to it, and I also wrote a response to it. It's a whole debate. I forget in various journals. I think it came in the Journal of Economic Literature with Sherwin Rosen, and I forget where Yeager, and then there were a few articles in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. So if you're interested in that, you could look at that whole big debate. My point, and what they would say is that we're really anti-free market because we should trust the view of the marketplace, and the view of the marketplace is sort of a nose count of economists. And what I was saying is, well, look, Mozart is less popular than rap music. More people buy rap music than Mozart. Does that mean rap music is better than Mozart? Well, in some sense, yes. The market speaks. But it doesn't mean that it's better in some aesthetic sense. Well, yes, there are more neoclassicists and more Marxists than us, but does that mean that they're correct? No, it just means they're more popular. And also, there are good and sufficient reasons to get back to positive economics as to why economists should be biased against Austrian economics. And the main reason is jobs. There are very few jobs for economists if Austrians have their way. If Austrians have their way, there'll be no Fed. Do you know how many economists work for the Fed? If Austrian economists have their way, there'll be no antitrust laws. Do you know how many economists serve as expert witnesses, both pro and con, prosecution and defense on antitrust cases? And you go down the list. I mean, if there was no tariffs, there'd be no dumping legislation and court cases as to whether, we're really dumping this or we're not or what. These regulations are a full employment bill for economists, and most of them are smart enough to realize that if Austrian economics comes in, we're all gone. We'll have to get honest work. Well, you can sort of see why we wouldn't be particularly popular. I remember one time I gave this joke at a conference of antitrust people. I said there are 3 prisoners in the Soviet Union, and as usual, prisoners get together and they ask, why are you in jail? And the first guy said, well, I was in jail because I came to work late, and I cheated the state out of my labor. And the other one said, well, I'm in jail because I came to work early, and they accused me of brown-nosing. And the third guy said, well, I came to work every day exactly on time, and they threw me in jail because I owned a Western wristwatch. And I got a big laugh out of that from these antitrust economists. Then I told another joke. I said, well, there were 3 U.S. businessmen all in jail on antitrust violations. And the first guy said I was in jail for charging too low a price, and they accused me of cutthroat competition and predatory pricing. And the other guy said, well, I charge higher than everyone else, and they accused me of profiteering. And the third guy said, I charge the same price. It's hard to see how you could charge the same price if this one's here, but I charge the same price as everyone else, and they accused me of collusion. Dead silence. A guiding light in pretty much all of them. There is one thing that I disagree with him on. Well, there are several things I disagree with Murray on. One of them came up on the film where he said that the Renaissance of Austrianism came about in 1974, where the South Royalton Conference started, and there were about 30 of us kids. I was a kid then. It's hard for you to realize, but I was young once, and I was a kid, and we had this Royalton Conference, and there must have been 30 or 40 of us kids, and then there was Murray and Israel Kirzner and Ludwig Lachmann, who were the professors. That's one thing that happened in 74, and the other thing was that Hayek won his Nobel Prize. And you heard Murray say that this sort of is part of the Renaissance. I think Murray was wrong on this, and I think Joe Salerno was much more correct in his recent article. I don't know if it's published or not, but he gave a speech on it, and he might give that again, where he said that the real Renaissance of Austrian economics didn't come in 74, it came in 62. 62 was the publication of Man, Economy, and State. And he asked the question, well, how came it to be that there were 35 young professors, such as myself and graduate students, that came to Royalton? Where did they come at? Had they come? Because at one time, Mises and Hayek thought, and this was amazing, almost 50% more than my previous record. Now that I'm an old duffer, I don't keep track, and I can't remember all that, but I kept track of how many pages, and I was feeling pretty snarky, so I called up the man, Murray, and I said, well, how many pages can you do in a day? Now, I wasn't comparing quality, just quantity. And Murray gives me, who counts? And and then I persist. I was very persistent, and I still am pretty persistent. And I insisted, you got to tell me. And you know what he said? He said 8 pages an hour. So in my best day, again, forget about quality, we're just talking quantity. In my best day, by far, and it took me from 8 in the morning till 2 the next morning, I did almost 3 of his hours. And he does first draft stuff. I mean, once he's finished with it, he's finished with it. There are X's, but that's him thinking along, and then he just sends it out to be published. No wonder. I mean, a good typist can probably beat him. I mean, a good typist, 100 words a minute, you can probably do way more than it's heard. That, he's just a giggly, kind of happy guy. Before I met him, when I read the stuff, I sort of pictured him as about 6'5", and had a machine gun here and maybe a spear there, sort of like a black power guy. And then you meet this little fat, giggly guy. It's the most amazing thing. He was also a joiner, an activist. He was in the Peace and Freedom Party, the Libertarian Party, a strategist, a movement builder par excellence, as you can see from his contributions to the Mises Institute. He is also a very prolific author. If you stack all of his publications side by side, they stretch for, I don't know, yards or meters or whatever. I remember once when I was a young lad, and I used to keep track of how many pages I could write a day. And if I wrote 5 pages a day, I would sort of say, okay, you did pretty well. This would be, a page would be 300 words, so that would be 1,500 words. And I said, okay, pretty good. Every once in a while, I do 10 or maybe 15 pages. One day, I got up early in the morning, and I worked from maybe 8 in the morning until 2 the next morning. And I did 23 pages. In any case, I want to divide my remarks into the public Murray Rothbard and the personal reminiscences that I have of him. Murray was, I would say, the best economist who ever lived, bar none. His books, Man, Economy and State, Depression, Logic of Action, are just the tip of the iceberg for him. He, in an era of specialization where economists nowadays don't just specialize in micro or macro or money or labor or methodology or history or trade or public choice or law and economics or environmentalism or taxation or anything like that, but they specialize in a very narrow area, say of international trade. You only do tariffs, or you only do tariffs between this country and that country. Well, in such an era of specialization, Murray was really an expert in all of them, and it was just the most amazing thing. His article on air pollution, I think, was the best thing that was ever written in environmental economics, and so on down the line. It's not just that he knew little bits of economics in the various parts of economics, but he was an expert, and that Austrianism would end with them. So, in my view, Murray really is the one-man band responsible for the renaissance of Austrian economics. The article by Joe Salerno is absolutely magnificent. Murray was wrong on this one. But he wasn't just an Austrian economist, a great Austrian economist. I would go so far as to say he was not only a libertarian, but the greatest libertarian that ever libertarianized, I guess. His book, The Ethics of Liberty, For a New Liberty, Power and Market, are just magnificent monuments to the libertarian edifice. He was also a historian, the inflation or the depression of 1819, his history series on the U.S., his history of thought, his revisionism, his conspiracy theory. He's just a historian par excellence. If he were only a historian or only a libertarian or only an Austrian, he would have made a magnificent contribution. But he was all these three, plus he was the leading anarchist theoretician. He was also a bon vivant. Even Buckley, who was no fan of Murray's, used to talk about Murray and his merry band. And you can see from his talk that we just